Welcome to all those who've joined us here at Harvard and to our viewers online who are tuning in from Burlington and beyond. As the curator of poetry, I thought I'd get us started with a kind of poetic invocation that responds to some of the many questions I've received about this book, and maybe one or two I made up. And then I'll be handing over the mic to the true introducer, the Honorable Louisa Thomas, who will give us the lowdown on our guest of honor, the one and only Dan Chasen. And so on with the show. Welcome to Bernie for Burlington, an event that celebrates a book that is not published, a book that is not for sale, a book that is almost provocatively, subversively not on time, at least not for this election. But this book, which will appear on bookshelves in 2026, the 250th year of this country, if this country, is what poet and sometime prose writer Ralph Waldo Emerson once called a candidate for truth, and abides by a different time zone and ethos. This book, and all 900 pages of it, is, in other words, the long game. Out of the gate at Midwood, Brooklyn, this book is the long-distance runner. This book was typed entirely, almost fetishistically, in a font called Courier by an author who knows damn well that courier means the messenger who runs. This book is an open mic night for our messengers. And like the town hall meetings it laud, it gives equal airtime to a myriad of sources, including poets, puppeteers, reporters, and politicians, post-structuralist theorists, pubescent skateboarders, and punk musicians. This book is a love song for local print journalism at the twilight of the analog era, and a fanfare for the people of the word, including Bernie Sanders, who began his career as a reporter for the Vermont Freeman and persists to this day as a passionate contributor to the Guardian newspaper. This book was directed by Fred Weissman, with scripts by Henry Adams and Larry David, cameos by Michel Foucault, Julia Alvarez, and Allen Ginsberg, stunts by George Plimpton, name-dropping by James Joyce, costume design by Breton Puppet, and a soundtrack by R.E.M., Peter Schumann, and Jonathan Richman. This book is thickly settled, is Thornton Wilderian, is Patterson, is Gloucester, is Concord, with the arrival of Alcott and the abolitionists, is Creeley, Cunningham, and Cage crammed on a train to Black Mountain, is hippies streaming into Vermont and turning the most reliably Republican state blue. This book is the slow-mo revolution of Grover's Corner, is Bedford Falls as Jimmy Stewart lassos the moon. This book is a memoir of community change and how a place's changes change its people. A memoir of a city as a multi-directional system, a memoir of a poet as a town's transparent eyeball, as a reflective citizen of Bernie's Burlington in Reagan's America, a memoir of language itself as our most private and public of resources. All language is fossil socialism, and a memoir of a self insofar as we understand the self as a series of meetings beyond our awareness. This book is not a biography. It's definitely not a hagiography. No St. Bernard awaits the reader. This book was baptized in the Cathedral of Dirt in West Glover, is a canon of rural knowledge nowhere written down, is a troubadourian oral tradition of odd-kin coalitions. This book is about a mayor who hitchhiked to his first debates, who sought to engage in what he called face-to-face democracy. This book, as Donna Haraway would say, is about becoming with each other or not at all. This book is a folk song by Pete Seeger, who said that folk is the personification of a man extending his hand to another again and again without losing his dignity or individuation. This book would shake your hand now, but it is still wiping the tears from the face of Willie Loman. This book is a poem by George Oppen, who insisted that the question of socialism is the question of the humanity of man. This book was a great labor and is about labor. And so without further ado, this book's author will be introduced by Louisa Thomas, who knows a thing or two about labor, civic duty, and the long game. Her must-read book, Conscience, was a groundbreaking group bio of her great-grandfather, the socialist perennial candidate Norman Thomas, who was often called America's conscience. Many readers now know this compulsively smart writer as the New Yorker's sports columnist. In that role, Louisa is the worthy heir to the great Roger Angell. We read her like we read Dan Chasen to understand human behavior. Her insights are as surprising as they are Dickinsonian and at a slant. You can see that she came up in one of the greatest of all farm system for writers, Harvard's English department. Please welcome Louisa Thomas.
Thank you. It's a hard act to follow. Yeah, it's true. It is my honor to introduce Dan Chasen tonight. Dan was my first teacher here at Harvard, and my best. He introduced me to poetry, taught me how to read it, and since then he has been providing that role to many, many people as one of the premier critics in the United States. He is an English professor at Wellesley College, the author of 5 books of poetry and 1 book of criticism. As you read, you can hear the cadences and the rhythms and of all those who came before him, many of whom were mentioned in Christina's remarkable introduction. But I never thought that Bernie Sanders was one of the great influences in Dan's life until I read this book and I saw that Burlington was, as he calls it, his education. And it is a remarkable book. It's a very unusual. It is a part memoir, sociological history, political history, a kind of countercultural history, I would say. And we're here, lucky to have Dan read from it tonight.
Thank you. That was so nice and amazing and so beautiful. Thank you both. Yeah, it's true. I was Louisa's first professor at Harvard in a strange scenario. It was a kind of pre-orientation course on poetry led by the president of Harvard, Neil Rudenstein, also a great Renaissance scholar. And I was the TF, and also I stayed in the dorms with you all, so that was strange. But I have read Louisa with great admiration ever since, and I kept her books close by as I was writing this one because just the quality of her sentences, the arc of her arguments, and the sort of personal angle, whether the subject is personal or not, highly impressive and useful to me. And so thank you. And thank you to Christina for planning this event with me, and to Mary Graham. The Poetry Room is a very special place, one of the premier archives of contemporary and 20th century poetry in the world, one of the friendliest archives, I think, in the world. And to put this event together with you, with a writer, with a poet, with a person of whose imagination kind of leads her through the world, has been a joy, a joy. And thank you to all of you. And my mom is streaming from Burlington. Hi, Mom. And I have some friends in the Pyrenees streaming this event, so hi, Jim and Meg. Okay. I put this together from 2 elements of 2 chapters of this, yes, very long book, which is very much still in progress. I'm just poking my head up now in the process, and then I'm going to go back under the sand for a few, more than a year, and at that point you can buy it if you want. Okay. Part 1, Socialism in New England. In early March of 1981, Bernie Sanders, mayor-elect of Burlington, Vermont, received perhaps his first Easter card from Mrs. Marion T. Boucher of Park Street. On its front, a baby cottontail hefted a bouquet of tulips. Soon, more cards arrived, all from old ladies under the sway of Sadie White, Bernie's octogenarian ally and ambassador to the city's elderly. One card offered all-purpose tidings, spelled out in tangled spring flowers and vines. On this happy occasion, may God bless you. Another delivered a dark portent. The flower looks up high to see only the light and never looks down to see its shadow. This is wisdom which man must learn. It was counsel Sanders could use. With the city's Democratic Party establishment united against him, Bernie welcomed these letters of congratulations from near and far. From Miami, Roberto Simeone of the Cuban Democratic Socialist Party sent his socialist solidarity to compañero Bernard Sanders. Tidings arrived from the Berkeley People's Party and, from the Lower East Side, the War Resisters League. Dr. Benjamin Spock, Bernie's old campaign trail sidekick from the summer of 1972, checked in from the Ozarks, where he'd taken a young bride. I married an Arkansas woman, Mary Morgan, a ball of fire, Spock wrote. We live in an all-glass, solar-heated house hanging over a 70-mile-long lake. Closer to home, Terry Lucius of Williston, Vermont, recalled daycare, years gone by, and celebrated a single-parent father in City Hall. And Angelo Leo, a barber in West Rutland, Vermont, wrote to offer a miracle cure for Bernie's encroaching baldness. I singe the hair that is thinning and have had success doing it. Sanders wrote back, your treatment for thinning hair sounds interesting, but I accept my thinning hair as one of the inevitable consequences of the aging process. Some well-wishers offered to move to Burlington or recommended friends already on the scene. Marguerite Crawford of North Avenue might be helpful somewhere, a woman from Waterbury, Vermont, suggested. I don't know her well, but she was a bookkeeper and could follow financial things and dig up meanings behind figures. Now widowed and retired, she wants to be an advocate. It wasn't so far-fetched. The mayor-elect, denied the opportunity to form an administration by a bitter core of entrenched city Democrats, would soon find that he would need all the help he could get. The Moonies Redux. A few days after the March 3rd election, Greg Guma of the Vanguard Press got up early and headed over to Nectar's, looking for a story. Mayor Gordon Paquette's allies slumped over Pall Malls and glasses of sour orange juice. We're used to knowing our elected officials, a Democratic alderman told Guma, growing up together and raising families. I don't even know the man. I'm numb, but trusting in God, added Joyce Desautels, the president of the Board of Aldermen. Bernie's victory by 22 votes would soon face a recount coordinated by these embittered foes. Desautels had last fought back dangerous newcomers when she and Mayor Paquette chased the Moonies out of Burlington in 1976. Followers of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church had been hanging around the UVM Green all spring, casting for lost souls. They would scan for the emptiness in a young person's eyes and foist a leaflet into her hands. To Burlington's Democrats, Bernie might as well have been a Moonie. He indoctrinated strays into a dangerous canon of beliefs. To say that Sanders led a cult was not meant entirely as a figure of speech. What else would account for the conversion of the staid, reliable electorate of Burlington to a wild-haired Pied Piper from who knows where? Sanders brainwashed the students. This was the armchair analysis heard all over Burlington. To the old men at the VFW or the Knights of Columbus, Bernie's followers, never voters, were probably draft dodgers. At the Rotary Club, Bernie's people were rabble-rousers from New York. At the Ethan Allen Club, where the elite of Burlington's business community met over plastic ashtrays and Grey Poupon in jars, Sanders and his circle were simply an element. Mayor Paquette had once told Richard Sugarman that people like you, Sugarman is an Orthodox Jew, are the problem in the city. The mayor accused Bernie of making Burlington, quote, more like Brooklyn. Now, with Bernie's election, Desautels began to introduce herself as a patriotic Christian woman. Moonies, Jews, to some in Burlington, it was all the same. I think everyone's scared right now, a city official told the UPI. If Bernie and his voters weren't Moonies, maybe they were commies. Overnight, Sanders' epithet went from the perennial candidate to the avowed socialist. Town elects a socialist mayor was the UPI headline that confronted readers of the Casper, Wyoming Star Tribune. Socialist mayor elected, read the headline in Galveston, Florida. In Bowling Green, Ohio, readers learned that the, quote, rumpled 39-year-old political activist was a socialist around the same time that some Burlington voters learned that detail. I voted for Bernie as a protest against Mayor Paquette, a local real estate salesman, Ben Bosher, told the reporter. Burlington blushed a little now that the whole world knew we'd elected an avowed socialist. The adjective implied defiance of decency, if not the law. In fact, the Socialist Workers' Party, for whom Bernie had been a presidential elector in 1980, was at that moment the subject of an FBI investigation. Sugarman, Bernie's hobby strategist, a Levinas scholar and ex-cabbie, had warned Sanders, his former roommate, to, quote, keep socialism out of the picture. At nearly 6'4", Sugarman said he found it very easy to keep an eye on the Orthodox congregation of Old Litvaks where he worshiped, and, quote, there were no leftists at Ohavi Zedek. When, late in the game, the Burlington Patrolmen's Association endorsed Sanders, quote, any possible Red Scare shenanigans came off the table. Now, though, with the recount pending, the city's socialism, avowed, shameless, out in the open, became the story. All March, Sanders had been dodging interviews with national and international media. Come see the freak mayor, he joked, correctly suggesting that he would grow Burlington's economy by becoming one of its main tourist attractions. When NBC called from Chicago, though, Sanders took the bait. Phil Donahue, the boyish talk show host with a cumulus cloud gray pageboy, wanted Sanders as a guest on his hour-long network program. Donahue believed he had discovered in Bernie, quote, an enigma in his own times. Sanders at first demurred. He didn't want to be, quote, the overnight spokesman for socialism, he said, adding, I'm having a hard enough time keeping my coalition together. He was then approached by Wendy Roth, a producer for the Today Show, where Donahue had a regular guest spot. To Roth, Sanders was an offbeat individual in an offbeat town and seemed to go against the trend in the country, Ronald Reagan and all. I am probably the only person in America who has never watched the Today Show, Sanders quipped as he boarded a plane from Burlington to Chicago on March 25th. The next morning, the rumpled socialist, quote, sporting tousled hair and no tie, was given celebrity treatment at the network's plush 19th floor office downtown, the Burlington Free Press reported, savoring the hypocrisies. The thought that you're talking to 10 million people all over the country sits on your stomach, Bernie remarked. But Sanders appeared to his host nonplussed and spoke in his customary rapid-fire manner. Donahue loved it. He's really very, very good, he told a reporter after the taping, pumping Bernie's hand as they posed for photos. The segment, titled Socialism in New England, begins with an intro from Jane Pauley and a slide of a brook gently wandering down a rocky slope. My goodness, how did this happen in good old conservative Vermont? Donahue asked Sanders. Well, Bernie answers, in Vermont, being conservative is different perhaps than being conservative elsewhere in the country. Sanders then makes his argument for the unique hybrid of leftist and libertarian ideas that he'd been developing since the early 70s. The cops supported you, didn't they? Donahue asks. So you had police officers voting for you who probably voted for Ronald Reagan. Our police are trade unionists, Sanders replied, putting the matter to rest. Sanders spends far more of the 7-minute segment defending his conservative credentials than making a case for socialism. Vermont conservatism isn't, quote, big money conservatism. It's not right-wingism or warmongerism. Vermont has always had strong feelings about civil liberties. What conservatism means is, leave me alone, get the government off my back. It's a respect for other people's rights. If we disagree, we'll talk it out. As for socialism, all it meant to Sanders was, quote, democratic participation. Finally, Donahue cuts to the chase. Are you a capitalist? He demands. Sanders, smiling faintly and leveling his tone, replies, no, I am not a capitalist. Donahue, yeah, but what if I build a better mousetrap? Sanders, do I believe the profit motive is fundamental to human nature? The answer is no. I believe in the spirit of cooperation, that you and I can work together better rather than trying to destroy one another. Part 2, making a scene. La Famille Baudouin returns home. Locked out of power by the city's democratic machine, a Red Scare intensifying on the city's streets, Sanders, his victory narrowed upon recount to a margin of 10 votes, now began to work outside of City Hall to assemble a shadow government from a growing list of volunteers. The arts in particular, he knew, would play an early role in framing his approach. The mayor-elect's first public action was to form a task force on the arts and announce a free festival in the gymnasium of Edmonds Middle School, headlined by old friends from the Winooski River Valley, the Two Penny Circus, a troupe of hippie acrobats and mimes. On March 27, 1981, when a spotlit butterfly fluttered out of its papier-mâché cocoon at Half Court, the Sanders era in Burlington was born. Now, Sanders and Doreen Kraft planned a free summer concert series in Battery Park to complement the Sunday night Lawrence Welk-style band concerts played before dozing old people. Sanders wanted, quote, to rehabilitate the atmosphere of the troubled park, which had seen another downturn: pot smoke, petty crime, muscle cars, tank tops. Bernie promised to serve, quote, many different tastes. We'll have classical, folk, country, jazz, even rock, which I personally have a hard time with. Appealing to local burghers for sponsorship, Kraft and Sanders soon booked their first act, the Birchwood Bell Ringers from Birchwood Nursing Home, where Sadie White had connections. The next letter went to a Cadillac salesman on Lyman Street in the city's South End, Wilford Baudouin. Willie Baudouin's jazz band had for years played supper hour music at the Burlington Country Club, breaking for Lobster Newburgh and a brandy sour. But jazz and Cadillacs were only Willie's ways of paying the bills. Willie and his family, performing as La Famille Baudouin, were the greatest living performers of traditional French-Canadian mountain music, learned from their parents and grandparents during kitchen junkets in their childhood home nearby in Lakeside. The family had kept a canon of songs and performance styles from vanishing. Their reels, hornpipes, and jigs originated in the wild, steep Laurentian town of Sainte-Amélie-de-l'Énergie, 90 miles north of Montreal. The Baudouins arrived in Burlington in 1937 to join the large French-speaking Lakeside community that fought to elect Sanders in 1981. Late in the 81 campaign, a Sanders volunteer had met Willie Baudouin in his vestibule and persuaded Baudouin to pick up his fiddle and play La Basse String, a traditional tune. The Baudouins were not an obscure act except at home. The family had played at one of President Carter's inaugural balls in 1976, and again that year on the National Mall for the bicentennial. Bob Hope had hosted them on his TV special. But the family had never once performed in their home city of Burlington, where French-Canadian culture lingered in pockets like Lakeside, but elsewhere dried up as people like my great-grandparents assimilated. I've always had a hang-up about that, Willie told a reporter, a fear that we'd be better accepted away from home. But this time I felt if it will help to clean up the park, I want to do my part. 800 people crowded Battery Park to see La Famille Baudouin perform in July of 1981. The three living Baudouin brothers, Louis the eldest had just died, and their children and grandchildren performed on fiddle, harp, spoons, and guitar, the time set by traditional step dances for loud clogs. Just to get out, see Burlington, I guess, Willie Baudouin told WCAX when asked his favorite part of the evening. Just get out and have a look around. Haven't been downtown much in a long time, I suppose. Burlington saw quite a bit of the Baudouins after that. Mayor Sanders, Baudouin said, had, quote, invited us home. The People's Republic of Burlington. I can't believe they elected you. Henny Youngman exclaimed when he greeted Bernie Sanders at the Burlington International Airport. A local rug installer unrolled a 3-foot wide strip of red carpet for Youngman to walk down, then handed the comedian a business card. The 76-year-old Borscht Belt legend greeted dozens of awaiting fans. I do banquets, sales meetings, outdoor fairs, bar mitzvahs, colleges, conventions, trade shows, he told a reporter. Anywhere they need a guy like me. Burlington evidently needed a guy like Henny Youngman. At the Holiday Inn on Williston Road, the marquee riddled, Henny Youngman knows that fiddling goes with a paucity of prose. What the hell is that supposed to mean, Youngman demanded. I don't know about this town. Arriving at City Hall, Youngman approached Linda Nydweski at the receptionist desk and demanded to see a foot doctor. What does a guy have to do to get a foot doctor in this city? Youngman kept saying throughout the afternoon. I need a chiropodist. It became not entirely clear that he was joking, but Sanders, proclaiming Henny Youngman Day in Burlington, was, quote, guffawing the whole time and never had so much fun in his life, according to Sugarman, who accompanied Bernie and Henny on their whirlwind Burlington tour, culminating in a reception at the Burlington Bagel Bakery. Do you guys serve scrambled eggs? Youngman asked the bagel people, prompting cascades of laughter in the crowd. Once again, it was not clear he was joking, but Sanders clasped his shoulder and side-hugged him, absolutely shining with admiration for the man. Everyone was calling me, should I move to Burlington, Sugarman said, like it was fin de siècle Vienna or Sartre's Left Bank. In spring of 1981, Gary Trudeau's sardonic comic strip Doonesbury gave Burlington a nickname that stuck. Trudeau and Sanders had met over breakfast in May when the cartoonist dropped into town to deliver the commencement speech at UVM. The Sanders character in the strip, calling into Tom Snyder's talk show, sends greetings from, quote, the People's Republic of Burlington. The host challenges Sanders, Mr. Mayor, let's be candid, okay? You're a socialist, you're a Jew, you're from New York. Cartoon Tom wants to know from Cartoon Bernie the answer to Henny Youngman's question, how the heck do you get elected? The Sanders character, noting the election of the socialist François Mitterrand in France, coins a slogan that became a popular T-shirt and button, which the real Sanders sometimes wore on his lapel. As Burlington goes, so goes France. Hearing that Bernie's car had finally died, a local Renault dealer offered Sanders a deal on the French automaker's compact Le Car, announcing a new promotion, a Le Car for Le Maire. Julia Alvarez, the Dominican-American poet and novelist, was among the first writers to take the measure of the new Burlington in poems written in her bedroom a few blocks from my home. Alvarez moved to Burlington in June of 1981 to teach at UVM. By the summer of 1982, she was living in the all-women's boarding house on Green Street, run by a woman in her 80s known to us all as Mrs. Perkins. Florence Perkins was the widow of Dr. Charles Perkins, a prominent doctor, and the name behind Perkins Pier on the Burlington Harbor. Mrs. Perkins was, quote, a Burlington institution. When she died at 109, they had a parade, Alvarez told me. She vetted us. It was girls only. You didn't do anything so crass as slip the rent money under the door. You visited with her. She dressed up as Mrs. Santa Claus on Christmas. She distributed little dish towels as gifts, Irish dish towels, with the next year's calendar. I became an osmosis hippie in Burlington, Alvarez told me. All my friends were coming home from hearing Bernie, going to Bernie events, going to City Hall to see Bernie in a meeting or at a press conference. Alvarez's sonnet sequence 33 in her first book, Homecoming, my Burlington book, as she wrote in an inscription to me, was mostly composed in her room on Green Street. The poems are an exquisite emotional calendar marking the days as Alvarez, divorced at 29, now 33, without a husband, house, or children, and ill with acute loneliness, gradually puts her new life together in the city, one 14-line block at a time. Homecoming is among the first and most durable on-the-ground accounts of the new Burlington, Bernie's city, as Julia calls it. The excitement of generational change and political possibility, the forces that brought those young, dynamic women to elderly Mrs. Perkins' rooming house, registers throughout the book as the sudden flash of attraction between writer and reader, paired across silence like smitten strangers on the bus or the sidewalk. Burlington's emergent structures of feeling wriggle to life in its pages. To me, growing up a few blocks from where the sonnet sequence was written, 33 reads like an homage to Julia's adopted city. The poet might have been addressing Burlington itself when she wrote, quote, "There's nothing you can do. By now, I am already inside you." What was it really like inside Burlington? Nobody had ever thought to ask, but now people around the world wanted to know. A New Age couple from Baltimore asked about Reichian mind-body practitioners. A far-left but always freezing fellow traveler from Abilene, Texas, worried about the winters. These letters were a constant during the Sanders years, as were Bernie's prompt responses on city letterhead. Some who arrived in Burlington asked to be compelled to stay. "I am writing to you because I want to make my permanent residency in Burlington as official as possible," Betsy Carter wrote from North Carolina. "I have enclosed a document, which I created myself, establishing Burlington as my one true home. If you would sign it and return it to me in the enclosed self-addressed stamped envelope before January 1, I would greatly appreciate it." Sanders dutifully signed and returned, and Betsy Carter invited Bernie to a, quote, "small candlelit ceremony," complete with readings from Plato and vows, to mark her arrival in her new home. Some people, when they showed up, thought, "This is it," Richard Sugarman told me. But Burlington suited the French historian and philosopher Michel Foucault, visiting UVM for 3 weeks in November of 1982, just fine. Foucault traveled from Berkeley to Burlington, lured by the excitement of seeing Bernie's socialism in action. Once settled in, he found a suitable restaurant, Lunig's on College and Church Streets, a replica of Paris, as he told his hosts. There he could read and jot down notes in peace all day, entirely unrecognized among the Quebecois tourists on the Church Street marketplace. In UVM's Bailey Howe Library, Foucault said he had, quote, "managed to locate a book unobtainable in all of Paris, the Onerocritica of Artemidorus Ephesius, the 2nd century guide to dream interpretation, and a subject of The Care of the Self, the 3rd volume of Foucault's History of Sexuality." Day after day, revisiting this mysterious tome with its detailed dreams of incest, spiders, and horses, Foucault sat at a corner table at Lunig's, or on the orange sectionals in the lounge at UVM's Living Learning Center, where my mother recruited many of my early babysitters. When I read Foucault, I often think of the loud vending machines in Living Learning, dispensing bottles of Fanta orange or grape for 25 cents. Sanders introduced Foucault at a public lecture in early November, reading a speech written by Huck Gutman. He then sat uncomfortably through Foucault's talk, whispering to Sugarman, "Do you think anyone in this audience knows what the fuck he's talking about?" And yet, Foucault's address, titled Technologies of Self, seemed chosen to speak directly to Bernie's Burlington. In opposition to the ancient Delphic oracle, which mandated know thyself, Foucault described a higher, more communitarian ideal, quote, "to be concerned with yourself or to take care of yourself in the interest of social and political life." Quote, "The precept to be concerned with oneself was, for the Greeks, one of the main principles of cities," Foucault said, recommending the undersung oracle as one of the main rules for social and personal conduct and for the art of life. In Sanders' Burlington, Foucault seemed to find hope for the revival of this obscure and long-faded ideal. Despite his restlessness throughout Foucault's address, Sanders beamed at a reception afterwards, joking with Foucault, "Did Huck write your speech too?" Foucault seemed perturbed by this, according to Gutman. In a seminar for faculty, Sugarman found Foucault slippery and impossible to engage. When challenged about his interpretation of a, quote, spurious dialogue of Plato, Foucault barked, "Technicalities." When asked his opinion of Levinas, Foucault said, "How can one even attempt to describe such a man?" Sugarman responded, "Why not try?" But the great man's visit was in many ways poignant, for reasons only a few in the community knew. Sugarman and Gutman had been told by Foucault's colleagues at Berkeley that he appeared to be already quite sick, that we attributed his dry cough to a chronic respiratory illness. Foucault walked quickly, bounding, according to Sugarman, from building to building. But when he arrived at his classroom, he breathed heavily and with apparent strain. The UVM visit was Foucault's last extended public appearance before his death from AIDS in 1984. Sightings. When Natasha Kinski and Rudolf Nureyev were spotted in line at Ben & Jerry's, it was clear that the stars were out in Burlington. Soon, Bernie himself acted in a forgotten Don Johnson film, Sweetheart's Dance. But nobody, not Don Johnson, not Michel Foucault, not even Bernie Sanders, could compete with the area's biggest star. In the summer of 1981, 2 months after Sanders took office, the mayor was upstaged on the national scene by a phenomenon even rarer than an elected socialist. On June 30th, the New York Times ran the story of a curious photograph taken by a Connecticut woman vacationing on Lake Champlain near St. Albans, Vermont. The image appeared to show the long neck and broad back of a creature rising from the serene waters of the lake, its head turned in profile as though acknowledging the paparazzi. The photo, authenticated by experts at the University of Arizona Optical Sciences Center, was greeted as proof that a prehistoric monster lived in the 400-foot deep waters of Lake Champlain. It is still considered the premier piece of evidence ever collected for the existence of lake monsters. Dr. Roy P. Mackel of the University of Chicago hypothesized that the photo showed some kind of rare, elusive mammal, probably related to the Zeuglodon, which was one episode in the evolution of the whale. After thousands of sightings over hundreds of years, the Lake Champlain monster, or Champ as he is called, had now been captured on film. It is hard to overstate the effect this news had on kids' lives that summer and in the years after. We'd been prepared for it. On regular field trips to UVM's Perkins Museum of Geology, area school children were shown the skeleton of the Charlotte whale, a small beluga whale discovered in a field in the nearby town of Charlotte one morning in 1849 by men digging Vermont's first railroad tracks. The fragile skeleton floats in a glass case. Its skull is repaired from the blow struck by the railroad band's shovel upon discovery. What was a whale doing in a cornfield hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean? The docent explained to our spellbound class, Lake Champlain had once been a vast saltwater sea, the surrounding mountains its shore. Our lake was the vestige of this broad prehistoric ocean. Our inland fields, enriched with marine minerals, were once its sunken bed. It was not a leap to imagine that a community of primordial creatures had withstood the sea change at the lake's murky bottom, surfacing every now and then to have a look around. Perhaps Champ was as curious as everyone else about socialism in New England, or wanted to meet Natasha Kinski. In July of 1981, Champ appeared again, this time near Shelburne Farms. 7 witnesses, including Sancy Sparling, the manager of the 108-room Webb family mansion known as Shelburne House, watched for nearly a half hour as a creature deep and fast and very long cavorted in the water just off Shelburne Point before swimming westward towards the Adirondacks. Sparling was clipping herbs on the sloping lawn, she told me, when she heard screaming, I mean incredible screaming, coming off the curved beach below, as a group of people emerged from the steep bank pointing at, quote, 6 humps with 6 individual wakes quite far apart. By the behavior of the wakes, the creature was figured to be over 60 feet long. "This will make my career," a woman exclaimed and produced a camera. A blurry image appeared in the Burlington Free Press, but Sparling's vivid description of what she witnessed traveled widely by word of mouth. Notice was put out. Shelburne Farms is not open to the public for monster sightings. But a month later, 150 people jammed into the property's coach barn, where the great carriage horses of the Webb's guests once chomped salt hay, to hear the testimony of esteemed scientists and eyewitnesses. Does CHAMP exist? A scientific seminar brought together experts like Chicago's Professor Mackle and J. Richard Greenwell of the University of Arizona. Mackle held the room spellbound as he described a shy and intelligent creature, a cousin to the Loch Ness Monster, who communicated in intricate squeaks like a dolphin and, landlocked herself, fed mainly on landlocked salmon. Some in the room wept as what they'd seen with their own eyes was at last confirmed by respected professionals or seconded by credible eyewitnesses. Sandra Mancy, the photographer who'd captured the shot, described a creature, quote, slimy and slow-moving and quite majestic. At one point, she worried that the monster had legs and was headed onto shore. Mancy expressed her concern that she'd opened up Pandora's box and pleaded with the group to do something, anything, quote, to protect this beautiful creature from man. Vermonters were in awe of Mancy's image, but also of the rumored conditions of its sale to the New York Times. The sum was not disclosed, but Mancy suggested that it had been significant. What if CHAMP could be caught somehow? P.T. Barnum had offered $50,000 in 1873 for, quote, the hide of the great Champlain serpent to add to my mammoth World's Fair. The fantasy was expressed mainly in the form of corny jokes, but the idea spread that a very big prize now awaited wily anglers on Lake Champlain. Champ's image, if not his carcass, would be the trophy. Champ fever took over the lake. There were more than 30 recorded sightings of the monster in 1981. Joseph W. Zarzinski, a school teacher from Wilton, New York, who had been searching for a decade for the monster at great personal expense, expressed the fear that the proof of Champ's existence would arrive, quote, on a flatbed truck. In June of 1982, with a bill moving through the Vermont legislature to enroll our ancient plesiosaur on the endangered species list, every living creature in the lake had a bounty put in its head. The first annual Lake Champlain International Fishing Derby awarded prizes in 7 categories. 3,000 entrants vied for hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential prizes. By arrangement with Lloyd's of London, 2 fish in particular, a trout and a walleye, were tagged and guaranteed to pay $50,000 to the lucky angler. Bernie stood on Perkins Pier and made small talk with the contestants as they loaded in their coolers of Molson and worms. Told about the prize money, Sanders shook his head. The way the city's budgets looked, he said, I should have chartered a boat. Then Sanders shook the hand of the Derby's founder and coordinator, my great-uncle John Delorme, and advised Captain John to, quote, be on the lookout for Champ. Delorme didn't hear it as a joke. He knew where to find him, near the schools of landlocked salmon in the shallows by the Lake Champlain Islands. Sanders, chuckling, looked a little concerned. Bernie and Champ had reason for worry. Captain John, newly retired from driving a cab in the mountain town of Duxbury, Vermont, was my grandfather's younger brother, as well as a family hero, for John Delorme was anointed by Bishop, the Free Press's revered outdoors columnist, as the most knowledgeable fisherman on Lake Champlain. John Delorme was a natural, and his big brother Milford, to keep up, outfitted his 18-foot walk-around with banks of technology, depth finders, fish finders. On trips around the Champlain Islands, I was so afraid of screwing up that I usually pretended to be seasick, lying on my side with a comic book as, cursing, my grandfather reeled in tangles of driftwood and seaweed. I don't recall whether I was actually rooting for Uncle John to bring in Champ that weekend, but nobody hauled the monster in or the 2 tagged fish worth $100,000. Vermonters caught the usual bony specimens, and then the community's attention turned back from the uncollected spoils at the bottom of the lake to the ongoing socialism on a shoestring experiment 200 feet above sea level in Bernie's flat-broke City Hall. Thanks. So, want to know what happens next?
Absolutely. So that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. One of the extraordinary things about this book is the chance to see Dan at the edge of the frame, as our kind of brave narrator as he grows up, basically, along with Bernie. And I wanted to know, it is an unusual book about an unusual person, and yet it's very unusual for a poet to write a biography or a semi-biography of a left-wing politician. And what drove you to write this book? What was the impulse?
Well, I first laid eyes on Bernie when I was 9 years old on our front porch. I was living with my mom and my grandparents, and I looked down from my bedroom window, and there was this wild-haired person with an aide with a clipboard, and I remember my grandfather saying, "Dorothy, don't go to the door, it's Sanders." And so from that point on, it had the allure of the forbidden to me, and then I just started to pay attention and had been, just in those years from age 9 to age 18, they're so formative, and Burlington really changed, and you could see the change in a daily way, and you could follow the change in the newspapers, and you could get to know the people who were responsible for the change. And that was just very thrilling. And part of the change was that the arts were suddenly flooding Burlington, and the first poetry reading I ever attended was Allen Ginsberg's reading in 1986 at the Memorial Auditorium. So in a very direct, which was sponsored by the mayor's Office on the Arts. So in a very concrete way, those opportunities were extended to me and others by Bernie's administration. You could really sense the change in the community, and what's more fascinating than change, really?
There's an amazing tension that comes through in some of the reading that you did between that change and the impulse toward preservation.
Right.
That seems particularly strong in Vermont.
Yes.
Right? You talked about how conservatism is different in Vermont.
Right.
And it's both libertarian, but it's also connected to conservation.
Right.
And I was wondering, that's a fascinating tension.
Right.
It runs through the book.
Yes.
Is that to you connected toward art? I'm actually asking this question because here we are at a Poetry Room event, which is an archive.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So yes. Vermont was the most reliably Republican state in the nation in the 60s and 70s, and the first Democrat elected, that Vermont elected for president was Bill Clinton. So it was a very, very conservative place. In terms of electoral politics, in terms of the culture, there was so much changing and going on, but it was really taking a very long time for that to bubble up into the political culture. So, yeah, the question of what you change and what you keep, it was the case in the city as well. There were new institutions coming in. There were mayors' task forces on the arts, on youth, adolescents, and so on, concerts, demonstrations, meetups. Very exciting time to be there. On the other hand, there were these state institutions that were themselves slowly changing and trying to preserve themselves in under the pressure of these enormous cultural changes. So sure. Maybe what attunes me to that is the sort of necessity that poets always feel to preserve elements of the art, but advance them by changing them, for sure, yeah.
Robert Frost appears in this book as a kind of Greek chorus, almost,
yeah.
Through it, and obviously his famous lines about walls. But
right.
But you have an interesting reading of that. This is probably the only biography of a politician I've ever read that has a mix of close reading repudiation of one's own poems. I mean, it's amazing. It's wonderful. It's totally unique.
Maybe it's the only one for a reason. We don't really know. But yeah, I mean, Burlington went from a Robert Frost world to an Allen Ginsberg world.
Yeah.
And so you could see that's one way of just expressing the cultural shift that we experienced, for sure. But, Robert Frost was a big part of the state's marketing to the world. Vermont, we spent a long time in the countryside before we get to Burlington in this book. And, Vermont preserved its landscape by marketing itself to tourists and to wealthy...
Including one young Bernie Sanders, right?
Including one,
Can you
yeah.
tell us that story?
Oh, sure, yeah. So Bernie and his older brother Larry, when they were 13 and 19, went from Midwood, Brooklyn, by subway to Midtown, and they got off at the stop next to Radio City. And there, the state of Vermont had its own kind of installation. It was nominally a tourist office, but you would walk in from the street, the busy street of Manhattan, and you would enter a world where there was maple syrup on a little burner, and the wood smoke, and brochures for property for sale. And Bernie and Larry brought home those, Larry has been very helpful in this book and told me the story firsthand, brought home those catalogs of farms and poured over them in their home in Midwood and sort of fantasized about this place, which seemed, very cheap. The cheapness of Vermont, which is also obviously no longer true, but at the time was a very important part of the imagination of the place, that you could go somewhere and make something new on vast acreage for almost no money. So yeah, that's where it all started for them, yeah.
I'm curious, there's a way in which the Vermont here, and there's an amazing history of Vermont in this book.
No, thanks.
And you kind of convincingly show it to be both exemplary and completely unique. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you think that the way in which it's changed reflects the kind of broader currents of progressivism in the U.S., or whether or not it remains a kind of unique place.
The paradox of Vermont is that it's 2 hours or 3 hours drive for about 80 million people or so, and yet it remains rural. And that has not happened by accident. That's happened by very aggressive planning, central planning, legislation. Yeah.
Codification. There's the story of Act 250.
Act 250, right? That's been our major land use law since the late 60s. And it's very controversial because it stipulates that if you want to develop a property on beyond X number of acres, it has to fulfill certain environmental criteria, but it also has to fulfill certain aesthetic criteria. And there are a lot of Vermont farmers who are destitute and want to sell a few acres off, to be able to fix the furnace or whatever it is. And they're told by the local planning board that they can't do it. So, that's in a way, the kind of landscape which meant so much to so many people and still means so much to so many people, it ceased existing organically sometime around the 1960s when the highways came in and other kinds of big changes came in. And then it had to be defended by legislation. And it's very different to go from a libertarian, roughly speaking, kind of libertarian framework where every village gets to operate in its own way and every farm gets to operate in its own spirit, to a progressivism which says, no, the state is going to mandate that you treat your land a certain way, that the village is going to have X number of open acres. Those are two wildly different ideas. And the effect has been that the place looks the same, roughly, as it always has, but the mechanism has changed, of course. Yeah.
I mean, you do also point out that there was this kind of strange effect of incubating a kind of grassroots political scene, like participatory politics, because of these, this legislation that was passed. I mean, there's all sorts of weird contradictions and tensions in Burlington and around Burlington that Bernie both seemed to be set against, but also to take advantage of in a very canny political way.
Right, it was a boom town. I mean, he was trying to run a little socialism in a town whose economy was thriving, partly because he became a tourist attraction. Yeah, the national economy was thriving by the mid-'80s and prospering, and Sanders definitely benefited from those economic forces that were, beyond him in a way. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, as you worked on this book, if anything particularly surprised you either about him or about the city in which you grew up.
Boy, I mean, there were surprises every single day. This process was one where I went back and interviewed people that were at most one step removed from me. Bernie is one step removed from me. So, but growing up, I'm watching it as my own point of view is evolving and developing, and learning about what was happening behind the scenes, learning the squabbles between the Sanders administration and developers who are trying to develop our waterfront, for example. Just how heated and contested everything was. Just little things like that, really just being able to fill the blanks in after, 53 years on the planet and looking back and thinking about what was really happening behind the scenes. Mm-hmm.
There's the chapter that follows the one where he finished. There's a proxy war over a bike path.
Yes.
Right?
Howard Dean was
Howard
the main
Dean,
player.
yeah.
Yes. It was his political rise. He and some other young guys who wanted to ride their mountain bikes along Lake Champlain, along the old disused railroad tracks.
And yet the lesson of that section is the same lesson of every section, which is all these sort of trivial, seemingly trivial things are actually very high stakes, both in terms of what they represent for these political battles, but also how they play out in the lives of the people in Burlington in very, very concrete and important ways.
Well, right. I mean, that battle ended up going to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the Rails to Trails, idea was ratified. And so these young guys, Howard Dean and his friends, decide they want a bike path, and they discover in their meddling that Burlington's waterfront, all this land, which is apparently available for development, is actually built on fill. And there are common law rules that govern any body of water that's filled in, and that land was unable to be sold to a developer for that very reason. So it's these little actions that end up yielding these enormous results. Mm-hmm.
There's a very funny scene where I think Bernie was taking Larry down to see the waterfront.
Yeah,
he could
can't
never quite get there.
Yeah.
And it made me think, to what extent Bernie was always a little bit different, right? He was always a Brooklyn Jew.
Yes.
In the imagination of, let's say, your grandparents.
Yes.
And the imagination probably of many people.
Yes.
Including many people who probably wanted to vote for him.
Right.
And I'm actually curious, did you ever figure out how Bernie sees himself?
I don't know if Bernie thinks much about that.
Well, maybe that's actually a great answer.
Yeah.
That's the wrong question.
Yeah.
Right?
I think Bernie saw himself as an outsider. Maybe this is an important paradox. He's not a joiner. When he was moving among the Back to the Landers and communards and the sort of figures in rural Vermont who were ostensibly his allies politically, he had trouble making alliances there. He had trouble making connections there. So, and he could catalyze communities in Vermont and in Burlington, but he would often then step back from them, so. Mm-hmm.
And that seems like a kind of important consequence of, but you end the book with him becoming elected to Congress.
Right.
And obviously that's long before we meet him, in the popular imagination. And so I'm wondering if you always knew it was going to end there, or whether or not you just got to 900 pages and was like, that's enough.
Easy. No. It's a brisk 900 pages. I knew from the start that I wanted to end it in 1991 when he goes to Washington. For one thing, I don't have a sense of Washington or contacts in Washington. I wouldn't be equipped to write that chapter of the story. But the main thing was that I was following three things. I was following his evolution and transformation as he becomes a rural or small city politician, this big city guy. I was following Vermont's transformation, and I was following my own, adolescence and growing up. So it all kind of ended at the same moment. I mean, Vermont became whatever it is now. I don't know if it's the most progressive state in the country. It still feels pretty conservative to me, but certainly electorally, it's extremely progressive. It became that way around 1990 when Bernie went to Congress. Bernie left Vermont and became a legislator after being an executive. Being a mayor is really different from being a congressman. And I left. So no, it was very clear that the book was going to end there. And I mean, maybe that does show that it's as much a book about cultural and personal transformation as it is about Bernie's story. Yeah.
Do you think there are these different moments in the book that you sort of note that things could have gone differently, and sometimes things could have gone better? There were certain moments where there could have been a conversation about race that didn't happen,
right?
For instance.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
And those moments are sometimes heartbreaking.
Yes.
And I was wondering if, as you look back, whether or not you think that those were real kind of forks in the road, or whether or not those were sort of, we have a more sort of teleological sense, like.
Right, right. We were just so ill-equipped to have this phenomenon happen in our city. We didn't have the tools. We didn't know how to have the conversation. I mean, the question about whiteness and race is one that kind of haunts the book. I mean, yeah. Vermont's marketing of itself was entirely around whiteness. There'd be this old Yankee farmer with a pail on the cover of Vermont Life magazine. And of course, there were restrictions enforced around for both Jews and people of color in Vermont going way back. And then, there's a chapter in the book about a crime that happened right before Bernie was elected, when a black man attacked a white woman at the head of Church Street. And it was an agonizing moment for the city, but right, there was never a conversation about it. It was just kind of swept under the rug. So I don't know if that answers the question, but we were just, I have great tenderness for the place because I feel like we were very ill-equipped to be a site of transformation. And that was what was exciting, but also somewhat scary about it. Mm-hmm.
Do you think, Bernie Sanders came very close to being the...
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
No one would have ever said so. He wouldn't have said so. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I am curious, there's sort of a crack at some point at the end of the book where someone makes a comment about the danger of Burlington becoming Sweden.
Yes. Right. That's his opponent. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I am curious, the United States is not Sweden. Right. As much as, democratic socialism thrives in certain places. Yes. And the knock on it, or what critics will say, is that it thrives there because certain conditions are met. Right. And are those conditions met in Vermont? And how easily is Bernie Sanders' politics and worldview exported to more kind of more diverse and heterogeneous places?
The challenge in Burlington, leaving Vermont aside from it, the challenge in Burlington was that there was no money. There was no tax base in Burlington. Like 54% of real property is non-taxable because of all the colleges and churches. So that meant anything you wanted to do in terms of a social program, you had to raise the property tax, which tended to affect the poorest homeowners disproportionately. So that's the story of his entire 8 years, is trying to get a little socialism on the margins, get a little program going. And he did great things. He started a land trust. He tried to municipalize the cable company. It didn't work, but it brought the cable company to the table, and they ended up giving us greater rates, and we got MTV in 1984 as a direct result of Bernie trying to municipalize the cable company, threatening to do it. and having the support in the community. So there were these little things, but it was really just, it was such a shoestring operation. What happens in the next chapter after what I finished reading, by the way, that's a kind of interlude chapter. There's a lot less political play-by-play in that chapter than you will find in the book when it is published in the year 3000. What happened next was a couple of really great accountants that Bernie had hired. The city treasurer and the assistant treasurer found a windfall in the books of $2 million just by using modern accounting techniques. Just by using, so here's a guy from Coopers and Lybrand and a guy from some other big accounting company, and they were brought up from Boston and installed in City Hall, and they went through the books and they found $2 million. And that was able to seed our community land trust, and that was the seed money for all kinds of little programs around the margins that were entirely successful and transformative. But I love the irony that it was like a couple of accountants, a couple of eggheads essentially, who were able to make those changes, put those changes in place. Yeah.
You know, it is interesting though to go back to the bike path kind of thing, which is,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, these things do make a difference. And what he did, they found this windfall and they solicited ideas from
Right.
like kids too.
Yes. Right.
And it does seem like representative of how he
Yes.
operated. And
Yes.
one of the changes that he seems to have brought to town was this kind of like openness to a different view of how people should
Right.
interrelate. I mean,
Right.
I'm going to argue against, like, part of his socialism was a sort of, it had a kind of like moral component where
Yes.
there were homeless people, but maybe it's not shameful to be homeless. There's a certain kind of like attitude
A tone.
toward
Yeah.
people, a tone, which
That's right.
And if you're cynical, you could say that doesn't really
Right.
make a difference. But if you're not cynical, you could say that actually is
Right.
very important.
Sure. And he put in place, at no expense or very little expense, he put in place what were called neighborhood planning committees, which were direct democracy, face-to-face democracy. City Hall had to make their case for development of the waterfront, or, you know, there was a quixotic attempt to tax the hospital, which is sort of the origin of Bernie's ideas about healthcare. I mean, he was just very offended that in Burlington there are not that many. There isn't a big financial infrastructure. So the rich people in Burlington at the time were by and large doctors. And that meant that you got your hip operated on and you got a bill in the mail that you couldn't pay. And the next day you saw your doctor driving down the street in a new Beamer. And only doctors had BMWs in Burlington, I swear to you. And it was very galling, you know. So that crusade to tax the hospital, he brought it to the people, and he brought it into these neighborhood groups that were not perfect, but they were impressive as forums for debate and dialogue. And of course, I'm like 13 at this point, but my friends and I all felt we had a stake in this, actually, partly because of what I describe in this chapter, which is that our city had been put on the map. It was suddenly really exciting to be in Burlington. And the thing to do was to talk about Bernie's initiatives, even if you were 13, 14, 15 years old. There was a broadness to his politics, which was very easy for teenagers to understand. Whether it was the moral stuff, it was the sense that it was wrong for doctors to have these beautiful new foreign cars when you couldn't pay for your knee. It was wrong for Ronald Reagan to declare that our city was going to be evacuated this is a long story, but there was a federal program that was putting in place evacuation zones, and the idea was that all of Burlington was going to en masse move. 100,000 people in the greater Burlington area were going to move 50 miles north as the ICBMs floated. And you know, Bernie stood up to Reagan, always called him Mr. Reagan. And kids were behind him, you know, it was so exciting. Just the broadness of the politics. It reminds me of climate stuff now that really engaged young teenagers. Right. A lot of Bernie stuff, it was intelligible to young teenagers. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that was the appeal of his popularity, in recent years, or connected to it?
Maybe, right? Sure. I mean, he's so popular with young people. Yeah, maybe. The sense that there is a moral
Dimension.
dimension
Politics,
articulated, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think so.
We're going to open it up to
Yeah.
questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this reading tonight. I will be pre-ordering, definitely.
I'm not sure you can do that yet. Maybe you should just give me some money, and
I'll email you.
I'll send it to you. Right.
So I'm thinking about the breadth and the scope and, the length of your project. And I can't help but be reminded of another biography. This is the year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Robert Caro's The Power Broker.
Yeah.
And also the fact that your project is about a man, but also about a city and also
Yes.
about a state.
Yes.
But from the slice of your book that we got tonight, something tells me you were not turning every page in a presidential archive. You have this really wonderful, eclectic group of sources that you're pulling from.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your research process
Sure.
and how you knew who to interview,
Right.
what
Right.
public access shows to watch, things like that.
That's a wonderful question. Let's see. So Caro, sure, I have that book, and you learn how to write about zoning. You learn how to tell a gripping story about things that are often perceived as quite boring. Luckily, as a poetry critic, I've gotten very good at that. The risk, though, with that Caro evades completely because he's a great writer, and that I was conscious of trying to evade was when something's boring, you can't be boring, but you also have to be sure you don't hype it too much, right? You can't make it breathless and edge of your seat. So Caro was very helpful to me. Other things, I don't know, like I love Henry Adams's 9-volume history of Jefferson and Madison administrations, like things like just how to get little narrative things done. There's a writer in this room, Luke Menand, whose books I study and love very much. So that was very helpful. Louise's books were very helpful to me, actually. On the question of where the story goes, right? It does not go deep into the archives of City Hall. It does a little, but it also goes into Lake Champlain for Champ. I mentioned this phrase in this piece, structures of feeling. There's this famous theorist, Raymond Williams, who was with me the entire time I was writing it. I was just thinking about the idea that he uses these very surprising terms. He says, to get the sense of the trajectory of change in a place, sort of, early larval forms of change, you look for forms of, I think he says, tone, impulse, and restraint. And I was thinking about the arts in particular as a kind of forum for those values, where we can find kind of emergent tones or possibilities or reluctances. So yeah, I just had a sense that, first of all, I'm not Robert Caro, and he also took a long time to write that book. It's absurd for me to even, compare myself to him, but I felt that, nor was the subject really comparable, because Robert Moses was in many ways a horrible person, and what he did was in many ways ruin people's lives, whereas I think Bernie was by and large is a great person and was a great force in Burlington. So yeah, but anyway, I don't know if that answers it, but those are some of the, in terms of interviews, I knew I had to do a lot of interviews. It was very easy to set up interviews. I reached out very early to Bernie and Jane and got no response, but I worked with people very, very, very close to them and in close touch with them, and he could have shut it down in a moment if he decided, don't talk to this guy, including his brother, some of his very best friends, all of his advisors from City Hall. So I found that setting up interviews was very easy because these are people that I either know or could easily credentialize myself. It was easy to win trust with people because somebody's trying to remember, oh, what was the name of that pizza place? And I can say, oh, Big Ben's on the corner of East Avenue and Colchester Avenue, and we're off to the races. So that's how it played out.
Carol famously had to move to Lyndon
For the
Johnson's-
Johnson thing,
yeah.
yeah.
To gain the trust of the people, you had to live there.
In the hill
you have the
country of
advantage
Texas. Yeah. No, it's funny because I was thinking actually when I was planning this book, I was actually thinking of writing a biography of William Carlos Williams, who I love very much. We have a funny story about this. Yeah. No, I can't tell it. But anyway, but the bottom line was, I don't know anything about New Jersey, and I don't want to spend time. It's not as bad as the hill country of Texas, but it's anyway. I needed to write about my place. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
I was curious, the book is full of close reading, or so we've been told
Yeah.
to expect. And I wonder if you have strategies for close reading Bernie's political rhetoric over time. I mean, I think as a part of the popular imagination
Yes.
we encounter now, of course, there's democratic socialism
Right.
and the Bernie bro, and even I won't do an impression for
Bernie
everyone,
bro,
but of
by the
course
way.
that's totally a part of how he's conceived. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering how he, what terms he used to speak about socialism while being in City Hall, and
Right.
how you've seen that evolve. I mean, no, it's a bit out of the scope of the book. But
No, that's totally within the scope of the book. So, Bernie starts writing as a freelance writer for these small papers in Vermont in the late 60s. And he's talking about economic justice, but he's also talking about a wide range of sort of adjacent subjects, psychoanalysis. He's really into this sort of rogue thinker named Wilhelm Reich, who was a kind of spurned disciple of Freud. And Bernie is thinking a lot about his parents' early deaths and about the economic stress that they were under. He's thinking in a lot of ways, Reich has a lot in his work about sexual freedom as being necessary for survival, for health, and how constrained the working class is in terms of just expressing themselves sexually. So his early writing is a wild amalgam. It's not so message direct as he has had to become, He speculates about all kinds of elements of the human condition, very much through the lens of this sort of, Reich is sometimes seen as the sort of father of the free love movement. So it's wild stuff. And if there's anything I think Bernie maybe is embarrassed about there are no scandals, I think, in his past, but the extent to which he went all in for Wilhelm Reich. The Bernie bro question that you just asked, now you may remember, this is sort of very arcane lore, but in the 2016 election, I guess it was, they unearthed an article from his early writing for Vermont papers where he appears to describe women as having a rape fantasy. You didn't remember that, I'm sorry. Sorry to bear the news. But anyway, the wider context for that is the writing and thinking of this figure, Wilhelm Reich. So it's a wild, it's the work of somebody who never thought they'd be running for president, and a person who didn't hold elected office until he was 40 years old, and who made money basically by odd jobs and by freelance jobs. And that's very impossible. So he lived very cheaply. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. Listening to you, I remember the Fran Lebowitz quote about Bernie. I don't know if you know it.
Yeah.
She's like, why would I ever trust someone who'd leave New York at age 18? Like, what's wrong with him? But what I appreciate is your keyhole into his younger self poring over those brochures and stuff. That was sort of an antidote to what she observed. My quick question is, if it's not too personal, did you support Bernie and his presidential run, and to what extent?
I supported him until it was clear he could not win, and like most normal people, I then supported someone else. Yeah, I was not a bro. I tell a story in the book about driving around in Burlington and having somebody gesture to me in traffic, "Could you roll down your window?" I thought he's asking for directions, so I greet him with a smile. And he said to me, "You're going to burn in hell for supporting that fucking," and you know who he was talking about, right? It was 2016. So, so I jumped off when it was clear to me that it was not happening. In 2020, in both years, I felt there's no way on earth Bernie Sanders is going to be the president of the United States. There's just, and I wish we lived in a country where it was conceivable, but I was a skeptic, and I think it has to do with how well I know about him and have followed him, you know, and how, in some ways, even more radical than he appeared on the national stage, you know, how much there was that was investigated. I mean, for example, in 1985, he went and met as the guest of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And, you know, this was a time when the Sandinistas were the sworn enemy of Reagan's administration, and just many, many, many things like that that are absolutely worthy and valid and wonderful and admirable when you get the long form of them, but they could easily be caricatured. So that was my thought about his viability on the national stage. But it was a shock that he made it as far as he did, you know. Yeah. And I think, actually, it wasn't socialism that made those candidacies finally not viable. I think it was Vermont's whiteness, actually. I think it was his inability to truly engage communities of color. That's my opinion.
Hi. You mentioned the public arts funding and programs.
Yeah.
I'm curious, I often find, publicly funded art to be like sterile or
Right.
dead.
Right.
What was different with him? How did he,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it sounds like he attracted really good people. How did he do that? How is
Right.
that different from other public art programs?
Right. So public art has a tendency to just enforce the political message or to be very earnest, or right? Is that the question mainly, or yeah?
A lot of times it's kind of institutional.
Right. Well, I'll give you one example. He started this youth center where kids could go and hang out, and within just a couple of years, it became the center for hardcore and thrash and skate punk in the United States. It's called 242 Main. Bernie had no interest in any of those styles of music and could barely even walk in the front door. But I don't know, it's in a way, he just fostered the arts without sort of directing them, I think. So, yeah, he wasn't sponsoring, only artists that he, that would underscore his politics, I mean, it was a free-for-all, really. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Oh, yeah.
Because this actually suggests something that what I learned about Bernie, which I never really fully understood, is that he had a real sort of sense of fun.
Yeah, a little.
Like when it comes to that stuff, he kind of thought this was all kind of crazy.
I think so, a little bit. You could see it, yeah. He had the most fun, I think, ever when he visited Yaroslavl in the Soviet Union for his honeymoon. And the images of Bernie in the Soviet Union at this long table throwing back shots of vodka made us all so jealous because he was never that open and unbridled in Burlington.
Yeah.
So yeah, but no. Towards the end of his administration, he allowed himself to show some pleasure coming through, but mainly he was the person that we all know, very serious, very
Cranky.
committed, a little cranky. Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you.